far-off and mysterious China has always attracted the attention of historians and explorers. One of the most popular topics discussed on the web as well are the imperial harems. And although there have been harems in almost every state of the East, and not only in the East, the Chinese harems were characterized by their amazing peculiarities. That said, many traditions, customs, and even aspects of the way of life look strange and horrible to a modern person. But to the same Chinese concubine, it is quite a standard thing. The topic of today's episode is wild Chinese concubines things that were regarded as normal at the time. You're watching Flip Side of History. Let's continue. Clear rank boards. The first remarkable feature is the strictest obedience to the laws and traditions of hierarchy in the harem, the violation of which was punished quite severely, up to the penalty of death. Each concubine in the Chinese harem clearly understood and was aware of her place. If the number of official wives of the Chinese emperor could reach 4, and the strongest yin energy, female energy, was possessed only by the empress, the number of concubines could even reach 10,000. After the head wife in the hierarchy followed the so-called supplementary wives, the number of which could not exceed 4. Each of these wives had their own established title: Guifei, precious; Shufei, virtuous; Defei, moral; and Shanfei, talented. The so-called first-tier female favorites followed them, then 9 concubines, senior concubines, followed by 27 junior female shifu concubines. The younger concubines were also divided into several categories, each of which corresponded to a different level in the ranking chart. In the first place were the 9 maidens, followed by the 9 beauties and the 9 talents. Next in the hierarchy of concubines were the 81, and not a single person more, harem girls, who were again divided into 3 grades, each of which had 27 concubines: precious timbers, imperial women, and female collectors. Some of emperors, of course, made changes in the staff schedule of the concubines, but it did not in essence change the classical scheme too much. By the way, in China there is a common saying, daughter of the 15th concubine, i.e. presumably a relative, but kinship ties exist only in hypothesis. The saying appeared precisely due to the traditions of the Chinese harem. The fewer was the serial number or rank of a concubine, the higher was her status, and the higher was the number, the lower was her status. It should be said for the sake of completeness that depending on the status, each concubine was entitled to servants, from 1 to 12, and a eunuch. Therefore, the harem community of the emperor could amount to a total of even 40,000 people. The access to the emperor's body. To be able to spend the night in the arms of the most precious ruler, one had to go through a whole ritual. Interestingly, the first wife and the next few in rank had the right to spend the night with the emperor just once a month. It has been believed that women with the most powerful yin energy should not disturb the lord more than once a month. Otherwise, it would immediately affect not only the health of the emperor, but also the entire kingdom as a whole. Therefore, on other days, the lord had the right to choose any of his concubines. And this is where the very real circus began. The selection procedure of a concubine was amusing, to say the least. First of all, the emperor had an album with drawings of all the concubines, which, possibly, he periodically flipped through and looked over. Each concubine was assigned a nameplate with a number and name. Looking through the pictures in the album, the emperor would select the ones he liked the most for the day. Then selected plates would be poured into a jade jug and the usual lottery would begin. When the fortune woman was chosen at random, the emperor struck a gong and called for a eunuch. Eunuchs were then in charge of the further process. They prepared the woman for the night with the emperor, did her hair and other necessary procedures, and before entering the room they stripped her bare naked, so that the concubine could not carry any weapons with her and harm the lord. By the way, the method of choosing concubines could vary. So Emperor Wu Jin, who was famous for his loveliness and forbid to marry in any community or town until he chose a concubine there, determined the night visitor to his residence in a rather original way. All the ladies lined up at the palace walls, and Wu Jin passed leisurely along the row in a cart pulled by goats. The goats were not controlled by anyone. As soon as the animal stopped, the concubine who stopped the carriage became the emperor's choice for the night. It should be stressed that the worst sin was to remain a virgin in the harem, so it is not surprising that every single woman aspired to get at least once in the imperial chambers. Therefore, it is not surprising again that the intrigues on the bed scene were very, very serious. It came to the point that concubines incited artists to draw their competitors so terrible that the emperor never dared to throw a plate with their number in the bowl. Intimacy with the emperor. And now, of course, one can only sympathize with both the emperor and the concubine herself. The intimacy could not take place in complete privacy. First of all, either the mother, the senior and especially trusted maids, or the senior wives had to be present during the process. The only reason for their presence was to help with advice in case something went wrong. Secondly, there was a eunuch who carefully recorded everything that was happening on a papyrus. And the eunuch wrote with red ink, from which later came red lanterns and the association of red color with intimacy. But that's not the whole story. There were also eunuchs outside the door who recorded the time the emperor spent in bed. As soon as the time was up, the eunuchs would tell the emperor that it was time to call it a day. It even got to the point where the people outside the door would ring a gong. In other words, if the emperor did not have time, no one cared. Tradition is tradition. Finally, the emperor was simply obliged to inform the eunuch after the intimacy itself whether the intimacy had taken place or not. Then an entry was made in a special logbook. Also, the emperor had to inform the eunuch whether his seeding was to be left in the concubine. If the lord replied with a negative answer, the woman was pressed on her stomach so that the semen would escape. And again, a corresponding record was made. This was why, if a woman suddenly became pregnant, which could well be the case, she was considered a traitor, and harsh punishment followed. Although the unfortunate one was in practice blatantly irrelevant. It's interesting that even the main wife of the emperor was not excused from the recording procedure. This was done, of course, in order to exclude any possibility of treason, and there were quite a lot of them, and not to make the emperor the father of a child not his own. Customs and traditions. Obviously, with such competition, girls remained unsatisfied, so the harems thrived in self-satisfaction, for which numerous toys invented in China were used. The love of a woman for a woman also shown in harems, which, by the way, the Chinese were quite loyal to and even encouraged it in every possible way. But the other traditions, by the way, can cause sincere sorrow and even disgust. Often after the death of the emperor, all concubines were buried alive with him, so that the lord would not be bored even in heaven. The concubine could be punished very violently, up to the death penalty for the slightest wrongdoing. In addition, concubines themselves during intrigues were not a stranger to murder and poisoning of competitors, up to spiking special concoctions, which induced a pregnant lucky woman to miscarry. On top of that, many girls, exhausted by the long lack of any intimacy, found fulfillment on the side, so abortions in Chinese harems were the most ordinary thing. It is sufficient to say that despite all the privileges and preferences for concubines, many parents purposely crippled their daughters, so that the emperor would by no means like them, and as a consequence, they would not get into the harem. Not the emperor's harems. But aside from the emperor, depending on his status, almost any other Chinese person could have a harem. Of course, rich and noble grades had the right to several, even dozens of wives, while others of lower status had the opportunity to have a small and compact harem of about 10 beauties. Even a poverty-stricken man to whom his legitimate wife had not brought an heir had the right to bring a new wife into his house. But the life of such concubines was often a real hell. For example, after the birth of a child, a concubine was often obliged to breastfeed not only her offspring, but also her husband's father and mother-in-law. Such a concubine had thousands of times less rights than concubines in the imperial harem. A concubine could even be killed for the slightest infraction, and she could be killed either by her husband or by any other member of the family. And despite the fact that the law outlawed that, the punishment was symbolic, either a small fine or a few blows with sticks on the heels. But poor young women were the ones who had the worst time of their lives. The birth of a daughter in China in ancient times was a tremendous problem. A girl was unable to feed herself, so especially poor families gave their daughters to other families in harems as early as 8 years old. The young girls were forced to do all the orders of their new husband and master. Thank you for watching our episode. Leave a like, subscribe, and watch our other episodes on Flip Side of History.